They came to fight for a country that was not theirs. Men with no homeland, wearing a borrowed flag. They marched through the mist of forgotten valleys, believing discipline could give their lives meaning. But wars born of pride have no heroes, only survivors, and sometimes not even those. In the jungles of Indochina, France tried to rebuild an empire that had already died and sent strangers to die for it again. The politicians spoke of order, the generals spoke of strategy, but for the men who fought, there was only mud, hunger, and silence. No one in Paris listened, no one cared, and when it was over, nothing remained. Not victory, not memory, only the echo of a war that was never truly theirs to fight. Before the Second World War, Indochina lay quiet under the tricolour flag, a colony at the edge of the map, where French rule felt as natural as the monsoon rains. To the Vietnamese, the empire seemed eternal. The French seemed untouchable. Then, in 1940, everything changed. France fell to Germany. Its empire, proud and vast, was left to fend for itself. And soon, Japanese troops marched through the ports and cities of Indochina, not as guests but as masters. The colonial officers, stunned and humiliated, were forced to serve under the flag of Vichy, pretending control while bowing to Tokyo. By 1945, even that illusion was gone. Japan no longer needed a French mask. It seized the colony outright, imprisoning French soldiers and administrators. The world turned upside down. A European empire collapsed at the hands of an Asian one. For the Vietnamese, this moment split history in two. The myth of European invincibility, the myth that chained minds as effectively as armies chained bodies, died overnight. If the Japanese could defeat the French, then the French were not gods. They were men, and men could be resisted. One Vietnamese veteran later said quietly, "When we saw them kneel, we understood we could stand." Out of that revelation, a movement was born. The Viet Minh in caves and jungles, they organised, learned, and waited. When Japan surrendered, they emerged not as subjects but as a people who had glimpsed freedom. The tragedy was that France learned nothing from its own defeat. When it returned as if nothing had changed, as if the world had not just witnessed the fall of empire, as if the lesson had never been written in blood. When France returned to Indochina in 1946, it did so not with conviction but with habit. The empire was supposed to restore itself, as if defeat in Europe had been a passing storm, but France was exhausted, humiliated, and hollow. The people had no appetite for another war, especially one fought half a world away. So Paris sent others to fight in its name. Ships arrived in Haiphong and Saigon, carrying an army of men who barely spoke French, North Africans in khaki, Senegalese riflemen, and at the heart of it all, the Foreign Legion, a brotherhood of exiles and ghosts. Thousands were Germans, veterans of a war that had ended only months before, former Wehrmacht soldiers, even former SS. They were promised a uniform, pay, and forgetfulness. In return, they offered their skill, their scars, and their silence. To France, they were convenient. To themselves, they were already lost. The Legion became the iron skeleton of a dying empire, the perfect instrument for a war no one wished to claim. They marched through the jungle, nameless, anonymous, fighting for a country that would never remember them. One legionnaire wrote home, "We fight for a flag that does not fly over our graves." The war consumed them. Ambushes in mist-covered valleys heaped that rotted skin. Villages burned and rebuilt and burned again. The Viet Minh learned, the French bled, but the Legion kept fighting, because that is what the forgotten do. Back in Paris, cafes were full, laughter returned, and newspapers printed only small paragraphs about the war. It was far away, and those who died there were not sons of France, so the nation looked away. No songs, no monuments, no tears. Only names erased by rain on wooden crosses. Indochina became a war without faces, and the men who fought it became ghosts long before they were buried. As the fighting dragged into the early 1950s, France's war in Indochina turned from burden to budget line. What had begun as an effort to restore order became an accounting exercise Paris could no longer afford it, and Washington was eager to pay. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, opened its treasury trucks, planes, ammunition, all stamped made in USA, poured into the ports of Saigon and Haiphong. By 1954, 4 of every 5 francs spent in Indochina came from America. It was a strange arrangement, a European empire propped up by a new superpower, waging an old colonial war in the name of modern ideology. For the politicians in Paris, it was almost convenient. A distant war, largely financed by others, fought by men who weren't French. Losses could be ignored because the coffins carried foreign names. Costs could be justified because the dollars were not their own. Corruption followed the money. Contracts vanished into private pockets, supplies were sold on black markets, officers dined well while patrols went hungry. The war became self-perpetuating. Too cheap to end, too meaningless to win. In Paris, ministers spoke of strategy. In Hanoi, men died for paperwork. Every shipment of rifles felt like a reason to continue, every subsidy a new excuse not to stop. One observer called it a war without ownership. No one truly fought for victory, they fought because they were paid to, and so the conflict slid into moral bankruptcy. France spent political emptiness, America spent money, and the soldiers spent their lives. When wars lose their purpose, they do not stop. They simply run out of people willing to pretend they matter. By the early 1950s, France controlled cities, roads, and airfields, but not the country itself. Every map in Paris said, secured. Yet every patrol knew otherwise. The French army measured progress in kilometres and body counts. The Vietnamese measured it in patience. Giap's men had no uniforms, no tanks, few radios. They fought from tunnels, from tree lines, from the night itself. They struck, vanished, then reappeared in places that should have been impossible. To the French, it felt less like a war and more like being swallowed by a landscape that refused to obey. But the blindness ran deeper than tactics. France thought it was fighting communism, Moscow's shadow, Beijing's proxy. It never grasped that it was fighting Vietnamese history. A people reclaiming their own soil. To the men in Saigon, this was about flags. To the men in the jungle, it was about home. The French built fortresses and called them strategy. They occupied valleys, rivers, crossroads, but not hearts. They saw villages as objectives, not as people. They spoke of pacification, but meant control. The Viet Minh spoke of freedom and meant it. An officer once wrote bitterly, "We win every battle and lose the war." Each success was sterile, each victory smaller than the effort to achieve it. No lesson was learned, only repeated. Back in Paris, maps changed colour, red, then blue again, then red once more. And no one asked why the blindness was total, political, strategic, moral. France could not see that it had already lost. It was not losing to an army, but to an idea. And no amount of artillery could kill that. When wars become exercises in denial, their outcome is no longer in question, only the date on which the inevitable is acknowledged. In 1954, France chose one last gamble, a remote valley called Điện Biên Phủ. The generals promised a decisive victory. Instead, they built a grave. Thousands of men, many of them foreign legionnaires, dug in under the burning sun. Germans, Hungarians, Spaniards, Poles, soldiers without a country, wearing a borrowed flag. They fought for pay, for survival, or perhaps for a fragment of purpose after losing their own wars. To Paris, they were statistics. To each other, they were all that remained of meaning. Giap's army closed the ring with quiet precision. Cannon appeared on mountain slopes the French had sworn were impassable. Every night, the circle tightened. Every dawn, the trenches crept closer. The valley became a coffin of mud and wire. Inside, the Legion fought like men already forgotten. They held positions named after women, Beatrice, Dominique, Huguette, until those names were carved into the ground itself. They called for reinforcements that never came. They buried their dead with bayonets because there were no shovels left. One legionnaire wrote in his diary, "We are ghosts fighting for a country that does not know we exist." When the position finally fell, the survivors marched into captivity through a landscape of ashes and silence. Most never came back. Of the tens of thousands captured, More than half would die in jungle camps, their graves unmarked, their names unrecorded. In Paris, life went on. The cafes were full. The newspapers spoke of strategic setbacks. No monuments were built. No families waited on platforms for sons who were not French. It was the perfect ending to a war fought by strangers for an indifferent nation. The Legion's blood bought nothing, not honour, not remembrance, not even gratitude. But wars built on forgetfulness do not end, they echo. Across the ocean, new uniforms studied the ruins of Điện Biên Phủ and whispered, "We can do better." They could not. France lost its colony. America would lose its certainty. And the Legion, the last soldiers of an empire already dead, remained what they had always been. Men who fought without being seen and died without being mourned. In the end, Indochina was not lost through weakness, but through indifference. The Legion fought until nothing remained to fight for, a war without purpose, for a nation without memory. They were the last soldiers of a vanished empire, dying in jungles whose names their commanders could not pronounce. No parades greeted them, no medals waited on return. Their reward was to be forgotten, folded into silence, erased by convenience. The politicians spoke of lessons learned, but none were the same arrogance that built Điện Biên Phủ would soon build Saigon. The same blindness that ignored the Legion's graves would one day fill them again with new uniforms, new flags. History remembers nations. It rarely remembers the men who die for them. And so the story of the French Indochina War ends where it began, with a myth dying quietly and no one listening.